Hi, I'm Brinley, founder and executive director of HS Connect, and welcome to Clinical Trials 102, where we're giving you a little bit more information about clinical trials. And thank you to Acelerin for sponsoring this episode.
My name is Brinley, and I am the founder and executive director of HS Connect, or hsconnect.org. And we are in Clinical Trials 102 with Dr. Martina Porter today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
And we're going to talk about kind of an introduction to trials. So we did Clinical Trials 101 previously and talked a little bit about phases and different things like that. So I'll start off, Dr. Porter, by letting you introduce yourself, telling us about you, where you work, and then we can jump into the questions.
Great. So I'm Martina Porter. I'm a dermatologist at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, which is one of the Harvard Medical School hospitals in Boston. I probably finished my residency training almost 10 years ago now, and HS has been my disease focus, both clinically, so I direct our HS clinic, our specialty clinic here, and also in the research setting for this entire period of time. So I now am the vice chair of research and academics for our department, and I've been the director of our clinical trials unit in dermatology for at least 7 or 8 years. And again, our main focus now is HS, and it's because we started off doing a lot of different disease states, but the need and I think the desire to really focus on HS research, it's just blown up over time. And so that's where the wind has taken us, and we're very, very grateful.
Perfect. We're grateful too. So thank you. I know, one of the things that we often hear in clinical trials, and especially with our HS community, because we are clinical trial naive to a certain degree, considering that this wave of interest and clinical trials has just kind of hit our community in the way that it has. One of the questions that we face a lot is how do people know if clinical trials are safe? And we kind of talked through the last time, what the different phases were. So there's a little bit of knowledge based on that. But if you just want to talk through, like, how would a patient know that a clinical trial is safe? That would be amazing.
Yeah, so I think there are two very important aspects when we consider safety in the clinical trial. One is the clinical trial design process itself. And so for clinical trials that are sponsored by a pharmaceutical company, we call them industry-sponsored studies. And those are the ones that tend to be multinational, around the world type of studies. And you guys have already talked about phase 2 versus phase 3 studies. But the key thing to know is that before any of these trials start, they need to submit the protocol and all the information about the drug to a regulatory body. And so in the United States, we have the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, and in other countries, they have like the European Union, for example. And so it's actually very heavily scrutinized from a safety perspective prior to ever starting. And this is for all trials, regardless of the disease indication. They even weigh in on whether or not you can have a placebo or no placebo in the length of the study. And the reason is that people are in research studies are considered protected subjects, and they really want to ensure their safety and that they're treated appropriately and with goodwill, essentially. And then once the trials actually get started, there are different regulatory bodies nationally or locally that are also constantly monitoring the safety of the study. So there's always an institutional review board that will review each trial before any site can participate in it, and they'll all scrutinize the type of people who are involved, like the investigators and the study staff, and make sure they're well trained. And then at our institutions, for example, we also have an office called Human Subjects Protection Office. So anybody who's in trials can also contact this extra level of support too. And then as an investigator or a physician, a study physician in the trials, I'm constantly getting notices of safety reports in every single trial that's ongoing for the medication. So all of that's constantly being done, and I have to review them in real time. I only have a few days, and then I have to report them up to the institutional review board if there's additional safety concerns as well. So every clinical trial from that perspective is the same from industry. And if it's not something that's sponsored by a pharmaceutical company, everything from the IRB down still applies to the trial, like if I were to do just my own trial at our own site. And then from the safety for the patient, which I think is what they're really interested in, is how safe is the actual drug? You know that phase 2 studies, they're really looking more at safety and kind of dose finding for the drug compared to how well it works. And then in phase 3, they're really trying to consolidate that knowledge in a larger study. And so the key thing to look at is the informed consent form for any trial that involves a medication. And by law, every single trial has to describe all the risks and even the percentage or the relevance of the risk, and how severe it would be. And sometimes I include language that's very vague, like you could get cancer or you could die of anaphylaxis. And when you're looking at that, you have to really take into account, like, do they have reports of this before, or is the mechanism of the drug such that we would expect those things to happen? And fortunately for dermatology trials, almost across the board, this is not really the case. But unfortunately, because of our legal system, I think that's always there, and it kind of distorts the actual risk for patients because you get so fixated on the very bad things. But most IRBs, and most consent forms actually make the risk stratified so you can see what the likely risks are versus the less likely ones. And then for drugs that are being tried in HS that are already approved for another disease state, there's options to look at the inserts, the package inserts in all of the drugs. And then I think the key part is to really talk to the study physician about all of this as you go through the consent form, because that is actually an expectation and a job role. So an informed consent should take at least 30 minutes to an hour to really review in detail, and all patients are expected to have all of their questions adequately answered.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point to, if you're in a situation where you're reviewing the informed consent with the study physician, that and you go home and think more about it and you have additional questions, ask those questions. Bring those
Exactly.
up at your next visit.
Yeah.
Go back and revisit and say, hey, I have a couple more questions. You really want to They want you as a study investigator to feel good about coming into this
Yes.
situation. And you as a patient want to feel good about coming into this situation.
Yeah.
So it's in everybody's best interest for you to
Yes.
feel good, to have the information and knowledge that you need, and to just really ask all of those questions, no matter how stupid you think it may be. If it's important to you, ask the question for
Yeah.
sure.
And
Uh,
actually, the best practice is to ask for the consent form before you ever go in for the first visit. You would not sign it at home, but it would give you extra time to review it. So you're not feeling flustered at the visit, too.
Yeah, and I think, are they working more on doing informed consents also in a more layman's terms, even if it's just like a brief summary of the informed consent too?
Yeah. So, the requirements by law are that it's supposed to be at a third grade level, the language on the consent form, but it can be very overwhelming because some of the consent forms are 50 pages long. And more now we've moved to basically every study should have a table of the study procedure. So you can look week by week and then look in the text for the descriptions of all the procedures. And then they should have, like I was describing before, this risk stratification. So the risks will all be written out in detail, but in a very short, concise box or table, it should list the common and rare side effects of the medications.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and I think, all of these things are it's growing, I think, as things are happening, because that's one of the main problems that patients have, is that 50-page informed consent, like, "Ah,
Yeah.
what is this?" Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
and also, yeah, and I think it's like some of it is things you end up talking about in clinic visits too for a lot of patients if they're one of your patients in practice and they're thinking about joining a trial. So, there's many opportunities, and some of my patients, I'll ask them about a trial and it'll take them a year or two before they finally feel ready.
yeah, yeah, and I think, um with that, it's interesting to hear the reasons that people are apprehensive about joining trials,
Mm.
um, because it does take all of us to make it happen. And we were talking about this on the first webinar that we did, about, we're in a space right now that we have a ton of interest in HS, and we're on this like wave of clinical trials that is incoming and will be here for a little while. But if we can't recruit enough participants to take place in the trials, then they're for naught.
Yeah, exactly.
And they just may not go anywhere. And we now, as a community, have potentially lost a treatment option
Yes.
because of that. So, and it's not just the recruiting and getting involved, it's the retention and like staying power
Yes.
of patients. Because from my understanding, if somebody drops out in the middle, like there isn't much time to necessarily recruit a replacement person to start at
Yeah.
that juncture. Is that right?
Yeah, so before every trial starts, they have to dedicate or decide how many participants they're going to have, and they have to estimate it based on the number of patients they expect to drop out or be removed from the study, because some patients do get removed because they have other health problems or they can't follow the instructions. Like, for example, they're actually not actually taking the medication. There would be no point in continuing them along to look at how well the medication is working. And so if there is a much higher dropout rate than anticipated, the assumption is often that the data that we have at the end isn't actually representative of the patients or the response for the population. And so an example of this would be if we look at who drops out and it's all the patients who have the worst disease and they're not having a good response, they do some different imputations of the data to kind of account for that. But when you get to the end, you're like, well, I'm looking at this data. I'm like, well, maybe it only works for people who have milder disease because you're showing me positive data, but all the worst patients dropped out. And I only think of people dropping out because it's not working for them. And we always make those assumptions. And so it can really tank a study or a promising drug. It doesn't mean you should not drop out. If something happens, that is definitely something that should be considered. But I think if you're going to participate in the study, it should really be with the intention that you plan to finish it unless something unforeseen happens.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the good things about understanding at the outset what your requirements
Yes.
are, so that you can make a determination as to whether you have I don't want to say the staying power because like you said, life
Yeah.
happens, things change,
Yes.
but that you have the intention of
Yeah.
staying in the entire trial. And we talked last time about how much money and time it costs to get
Yeah.
drugs to market,
Yes.
and it's an
Yes.
incredible
Billions of
amount of both.
dollars. Yeah. It's
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah,
But it's
definitely.
also, yeah. And when you were saying before, I mean, like, nobody's going to force patients to join a clinical trial. That's not what we try to do. But you're right. This is kind of the golden hour for us as a disease state. And if we run out of participants, or meaning patients who are interested in participating in the study, then the development will slow. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your opinion, pharmaceutical companies care about the bottom line and they require investments from other groups to really fund these drugs. And if they show them that nobody's interested in even enrolling in the study, it actually makes people think that nobody was interested in taking this drug down the line. So why would we ever want to keep investigating research? And so it's just like a tricky place to be because we really do have to appreciate every single person who participates in research because without them, we would get nowhere. And they're the only ones that can do that.
Yes, and that's what we've spent time talking about too, is how important it is for us to show up as a community because
Yeah.
we're the only people that can keep this wave happening and keep the interest that we have right now.
Yeah.
And exactly like you said, if if we don't keep fulfilling clinical trials, then the interest in them is going to stop and slowly disappear, and we don't necessarily get a second chance at this. So it's
No.
important that we're all participating to whatever degree we can if we fit that inclusion exclusion criteria and if the trial is right for you.
Yeah.
Um, so one of the questions that we get a lot and is people are unsure about, like, and this obviously varies per trial, but what happens at like your initial visit? So we kind of talked about the informed consent. And
Yes.
then can most patients in most trials, we'll just generalize, expect to have like a physical exam the first visit? What is your experience with that?
Yeah, so I always say that the first visit which is what we call the screening visit, where you sign the consent form, is the longest visit. And the things that will always happen there are you will sign the informed consent before any research procedures can be done on you, meaning they can't even like examine you until you sign that consent form. But most of the inclusion and exclusion criteria for trials are dependent upon your history. So how long you've had the disease, how severe your disease was, meaning what treatments you received for it, and then what are your other health problems too. And so it takes a while, especially if the doctor is not one that you're very familiar with, to collect all that information. And it's in your own best interest to really disclose all of that to make sure that you're a good fit for the study. And then beyond that, for trials where you're getting a study medication or a drug that goes either on your skin or even or into your system, like in your blood or through your skin, there's usually labs that are taken. So they often do blood tests just to make sure you're healthy and there's not any undiagnosed problems. And then there is a physical exam, and it usually entails both like a general physical exam that you would get from your primary care physician or provider, for example, because again, they want to make sure that your overall health is good enough to enter a study. And then there's a disease specific exam. And there's probably only one or two exceptions that I can think of in 100+ trials where you wouldn't get a disease assessment and physical exam in the first visit because you would get it at the second visit. But the other thing that I tell patients is that the disease assessment for a physical exam for HS incorporates your entire body. So you can't be like, oh, I have something in the groin and I'm uncomfortable showing it to you. And they could just skip that and then look at the other areas. And this is because oftentimes when we put people in trials, we need to know what their most severe area is. And their overall improvement is dependent on their whole body, not just like their armpits, for example. And so if we don't count like lesions or HS spots in the groin, then we might be missing a huge amount of their disease. And it could go from either they had lots of improvement or to no improvement because we've not examined everyone fully. And then most of the time, you're not going to get the medication on the first visit that you're there. Sometimes, for example, we do laser procedures as clinical trials, and we're not waiting on blood tests or any other results like that back. So we can go and do the procedure that day after verifying the consent. But most studies, they'll check your heart too. So you'll get an EKG, and sometimes you'll get a chest x-ray if they want to make sure you don't have tuberculosis. And all of those things I think take a little extra time and are very different from how you would be seen if you just went to see me in my regular office.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like a very thorough exam, and I understand
Yes.
why it takes the most time for sure. Um, the other question that comes up a lot for us is, and a point of frustration, I think, for a lot of patients is the why do I keep filling out the same
Yeah.
forms? So,
Yes.
can you shed some light on that?
Actually, somebody in the IRB asked me the same question the other day, and I think that there's two answers to that. The good answer is that we take into account patients' quality of life and how they perceive their disease and the impact it has on their day-to-day activities or their sexual health or their mood. Like all those things are very important. And we want to show that being on a treatment that helps the skin based on how I assess your skin at the beginning and at the end also actually has an impact on your quality of life. And the only way to measure that is by giving questionnaires. I think the bad answer, unfortunately, is why do we have to keep doing them over and over is because we don't have great questionnaires in HS still, I think, that have correlated really strongly with we notice patients' skin are getting better and their quality in life is a lot better. And for example, pain in our clinical trials or itch even in other disease states like psoriasis, once the patient's skin gets 90% better, they have no more pain and they have no more itch. But for HS patients, we always see improvements in pain, for example, but then they plateau. And their disease may continue to get better based on what I'm assessing, but their pain has not gotten better. And I have lots of theories about this, but I think this is why, unfortunately, for HS trials, we end up with so many extra questionnaires because we're still trying to figure out what the best questionnaire is from a patient perspective to show impactful change. And so, yes, it gets very tiring, and some of the questionnaires are overlapping. You're answering the same question 5 times on 5 different questionnaires with like slightly different words, and I too would go crazy. But it's mostly because we're waiting for one good questionnaire to really rise to the top.
Yes. Well, and it is important, especially if you're asked to do like a daily diary, because
Yes.
while it may seem very cumbersome and irritating, I'm answering the same
Yeah.
questions, it does matter. And part of the reason I think too is because our recall bias is so
Yeah.
short. So if they asked us to do it once a week,
Yeah.
sometimes your only remembrance is as far
Yeah.
back as your last flare.
Yeah.
So really getting that on a daily basis
Yeah.
is important. But yes, I think sometimes it's
Yes.
like, can I push
Yeah.
that happy face button instead of
Yeah. I know. Well,
policy?
and I think I mean, you brought up a good point, which is the flares. And because patients have these flares that are episodic, and some patients' flares are very short and others are longer, sometimes they really impact the questionnaire outcomes because if you catch a patient at a flare who overall is like 75% better, but at that one point in time, they're like not any better than when they started, the questionnaires are going to look the same. And then it's just, that's why they try to do them daily because they want to show that for most of the time, you're
Yeah.
doing better.
Yeah, no, it's funny. It totally makes sense, but it's one of those things
Yeah.
that, and I think like even to explain to patients ahead of time, like,
Yeah.
okay, this is gonna seem crazy making, but really you're gonna answer the same
Yeah.
questions every day.
Yeah.
Even just giving patients the explanation of why I think helps, just because
Yeah.
when you're just like going through the system and going through the motions and you don't understand the
Yeah.
reason why behind it, then you may be like, what the
Yeah.
heck is happening? But if you give just a little bit of that info, it's like, okay, now I
Yeah.
understand why this is
Yeah.
happening.
Well, and I also did the topical ruxolitinib cream for HS study. I presented the data, but also as an investigator. And if a patient doesn't log that they applied the cream, I have to log whether or not you applied the cream for all of those dates. And same thing like if you took the pills. And so then I'm sitting there in your visit for an extra 30 minutes being like, well, what about on this day? Do you remember if you put the cream on in the morning or you didn't put the cream on in the morning? And they're like, I was on a river raft, so I probably didn't put it on that day. And
No.
I'm like, oh, or it washed off. And I was like, I don't even know how to to document that.
Yeah, what do I put? Can I put a
Yeah.
half like a slacks?
Yeah. So it's much better, I think, if a patient does it at the time because they'll know what's happening because in the end they still want that data and that's the real issue.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Um, what happens if, and this comes up a lot too in the community, is what happens if something goes wrong during a trial?
Yeah.
So they call it an adverse event, correct?
Yeah.
Is
So
the fancy term.
yes. And honestly, for patients that are in trials for many years, over 80% of patients will have an adverse event at that time. It may not be due to the study drug, but it's very hard sometimes to tease out. For example, if you got a cold, like I have right now, and you were taking a medication that increases risk of infection, did you get that cold because you're taking the medication, or would you have got that cold anyways because all your kids who are not on the medication have the same cold? And so I think for the main thing is that we grade all the infections or adverse events from like mild all the way up to severe. The ones we care about are the severe adverse events. The thing I always tell patients is that as soon as something happens to you, you should call your study physician because often there's protocol specific requirements, but I'm also a doctor, independent of me being an HS specialist and me being a clinical trialist. And so part of our training is that we really want to make sure that you're treated for them, especially because you're in the study and you may be at higher risk of having an outcome from the same cold that you wouldn't have gotten if you were on the medication. Um, but there is a section in all the consent forms too that talks about what to do if you have what they call a research related injury, meaning something about being in the trial almost directly or most likely cause something bad to happen to you, then there is a whole process where we report it, people evaluate it, you receive your medical care, but it may actually then be paid for by the sponsor of the pharmaceutical company. So the key features are that if something happens to you, you should tell the study investigator right away, and you should seek care emergently if you need it right away. And then it may be paid back depending on how it's deemed. But like, you know, the ones that are always that we always say, like, oh, someone broke their leg because they were playing a sport, like those are usually not related to the medication, but they would still be logged as a serious adverse event, and they would come up in all the reports from there on out for that drug.
Let's just hope there's not a paucity or
Yeah.
a lot of broken legs in
Yes, exactly.
HS study, so that may ends up on the commercial talking about the
Yeah.
risk of broken
Yeah,
legs.
exactly. And that's what happens at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, exactly. And I was just gonna ask, is that why that like is so long?
Yeah,
When they
it
talk
is
about the
because
risks.
because everything that gets reported as serious adverse events, so things that require people to get hospitalized or die from, those come up, and they really do, even if they're not necessarily related to the drug, it's very hard to prove it one way or the other because so many things happen to people in life, and so then they do come up as like all these warning signs, and if there's a certain number, then it comes up on the package inserts for the drugs in like bold letters, like this is a real risk. So
I think one of the hard things too for that I've noticed or I've brought up too in HS is that there's really no breakdown by disease state what the actual
yeah,
risks are. So I found that to be interesting with,
uh,
how do you make an
yeah,
informed decision when you have especially an indication that's used for multiple disease states
yes,
with potentially
yeah,
like a much older general population who are taking
yes,
that drug. So how do how do you decide what the
yeah.
risk factors are like per disease state?
Yeah, so it's a very difficult question, both in clinical trials, but also in clinical practice. Personally, some of the things that I use to guide me are what disease state is sort of like HS from like a pathophysiology mechanism and an epidemiology standpoint, meaning is the type of inflammation sort of the same? And are the patients that have this disease sort of the same? Meaning HS patients, we usually think of younger patients, not like 50-plus-year-olds essentially who are getting disease. And at least in the US, we see more women than men, but that definitely doesn't hold true outside of the US. And who knows about access to care and who's really getting diagnosed. So we won't talk about that now, but and then they also know there's higher proportions of smokers, for example, sometimes. And a good example is a JAK inhibitor. So there's multiple trials now for HS for JAK inhibitors like povorcitinib or upadacitinib. And upadacitinib, for example, has already been approved for other disease states like inflammatory bowel disease and atopic dermatitis or eczema. And so, but there were many predecessors to that drug too that were JAK inhibitors. And when they first came out, there were a few patients who had blood clots in rheumatoid arthritis trials. So, sort of similar inflammation to HS compared to how eczema and HS relates, but a much older, sicker population. And a lot of those patients were also on other immune suppressants and had like cardiovascular disease, like heart problems, and they were sedentary because their joints don't really work well. And so they kind of brushed it off as like maybe it's a disease state thing because those patients are at higher risk of clots. And then it took many, many years of real world evidence. And so this is part of my point is that we probably won't know at the time that people are doing the study what is specific to the disease state, but we'll find out eventually. And now, for example, a lot of companies with JAK inhibitors think that the risk of the cardiovascular effects and the clots is low in eczema patients because they're young and they don't have the same type of inflammation. but it makes it very difficult for me, for example, to be like, well, an HS patient is sort of like a rheumatoid arthritis patient because they have way more inflammation, but they're sort of like an eczema patient because they're much younger. So, and then it's like only time, unfortunately, would tell. But the good news is, like, for drugs that already have cousins that are out there, we can sometimes extrapolate and make guesses about what the risk is, but we'll never know until many years after the drug is approved, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's really neat to see drugs that already have success in other disease areas to be tried or used in HS and to find success there. And the other thing that's interesting is even through failed trials, I feel like something is always learned or gleaned from
Yes.
the data from that trial. Like
Yeah.
it puts somebody on a different path as far as research goes to be
Yeah.
like, oh, okay, well, maybe we should look at
Yes.
this instead. Or I find that really fascinating because even
Yeah.
though it was a failed attempt, so to speak, but that something is always learned from those failed
Yeah.
attempts.
Yeah. We always joke that we would figure out the how HS works as a disease state by trying every single drug possible and being like, well, it must be signaled by this because this
Yeah.
drug works, and it must not be signaled by this because this drug doesn't work. But yes, a lot of
Yes, just
lessons
line
learned.
everybody up
Yeah.
and yeah, do it all. Do it all.
Yeah.
Um, so what happens for patients that are successful and the drug works for them and they participate in the study and they're coming to the end of it? And the thought of being without that drug now is
Yeah.
overwhelming. So what happens to them?
Oh, yeah. That question actually comes up a lot before patients ever even start the study. And this is where it's actually very, I think, important to understand the difference between a phase 2 and a phase 3 trial. Because most phase 2 trials are shorter, and when they end because if the drug is not approved for any other disease, then there's no way to get that drug after the trial is done. Very rarely they'll provide drug as part of a longer extension, or even rarer, they'll allow patients to enroll into a phase 3 study at the end of the phase 2. But that, I would say, has only happened a handful of times for a phase 2. For a phase 3 study, if the results are looking promising, they usually announce while the patients are in the study that they'll be doing a long-term extension. And the extensions can be designed different ways. Some patients continue on drug, and some actually go through what they call like a randomized withdrawal, depending on how they're designed. So a patient might have been on a study drug for a year and then take it off at the extension, and then if they lose response, put back on again. So, but most of the long-term extensions after phase 3 are designed to provide the drug to patients kind of as a thank you until it gets approved in their own country for that disease state. So I always tell patients, especially ones who have insurance issues, that I'll sometimes preferentially try to put them in a phase 3 trial, knowing that it means that they could have access to a drug for 3 to 5 years if it is working. And also, we sort of know after the phase 2 if we expect it to work or not in phase 3. So it's kind of more of a assurance. But for patients who are finishing the trial, some actually stop after they finish the phase 3 and they or the 2 and they don't want to do an extension. I've had that a couple times just because they felt like their disease was a lot better or they didn't want to be in a study anymore. But usually what I do is once the trial is coming to an end, meaning a month or two before the end, we evaluate how the patient is doing, like is the drug working? And then we look at what's available commercially, meaning what drugs are out there. And so if there's a drug within the same class, like you're on a JAK inhibitor called povorcitinib, but you're going to go, maybe I can't get that now, but upadacitinib's available. I won't be able to do dose to dose, like to kind of match them up. And all those drugs are still slightly different, which is why they get their own trials. But we'll start doing kind of authorizations and appeals with the insurance company to see if we can transition them to something similar. If the really possible one is if the drug is already available for another disease state, we can sometimes transition them to the same drug either through the insurance or through us the pharmaceutical company's patients assistance program. But I've run into different situations where the dose that they got in the trial isn't actually available commercially. And so then we're kind of making up a different dosing scheme to use the available syringes and change kind of how frequently we give them to match based on like what we expect the pharmacokinetics to be, meaning how long does the drug last in the system and what's the maximum dose that they'll achieve. So we do plan for this with patients, and I think it's very important for patients to ask about this when they start and then while they're in the study too.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you had mentioned that some people didn't want to
Yeah.
continue, even
Yeah.
though their HS had gotten
Improved.
better.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is
Yeah.
it's a really interesting like conundrum, I think, and I've heard this from multiple people, um, that sometimes patients just stop taking the study drug even during the study
Yeah.
because they feel like they're doing really well.
Better. Yeah.
And it's one of those things that I just, part of me wonders if it has to do with the antibiotics that we're given so frequently, like a course of 3 months. Everything is like 3 months, wait, 3 months, three
Yeah.
months. So I wonder sometimes if there's something in our
Yeah.
head that has that 3 month
Yeah.
mark at it.
Well, I don't have HS, but I know just from taking medications in general, I think it's everyone's natural desire to see if they really need the medication anymore. And unfortunately, we don't have any tests to tell you at the time that's like, oh, test says if you stop this, you'll get worse. And so everyone in clinical practice, especially, they'll be like, oh, I stopped it for a few months and it was definitely helping. I didn't think so before, but it was definitely helping. And I also think it's just very tiresome sometimes to be in a trial, to come in for the visits. And one of the things that the long-term extensions try to do, because they're no longer trying to show the drug works, they do want to show that people maintain their response, but they're really looking for long-term safety outcomes in patients. So they tend to decrease the visit frequency. So patients who used to come in like every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks could come in every 8 weeks or every 12 weeks. And that really, I think, makes a huge difference. And there's less testing in there because they're not getting as many assessments, not as many questionnaires. The daily diary is definitely gone by that point. But it can be a lot for people, and people's life situations change. Like I had lots of patients in trials during COVID, and they came us wearing cloth masks, like when everyone else was wearing N95s and they couldn't be found. And they ended up moving away for various reasons. And for those patients, we do actually try to transfer them to another site that's close to where they are. And that sometimes works and sometimes it doesn't, depending on when they're planning to move and who the closest person is down there. But there's definitely lots of options to explore too. So if some of those life circumstances happen, we usually try to make it happen for you as long as you're out of the first period of the study.
Yeah, and I think, it's also really interesting when we talk about the retention piece and sticking with the trial, and to have those discussions if you're coming up against something in your personal life that may be a potential issue, to talk about those things with the study coordinator or with your study physician, because there may be ways to work around those things
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
um and
Yeah.
pharma companies are getting more and more invested with working with patient advocacy groups on
Yeah.
study trial design, which I think is also very helpful. How
Yeah.
can we decentralize some of this stuff that isn't necessary to be
Yes.
in person for?
Yes.
There will always be a need to be in
Yeah.
person at certain points,
Yes.
because if you're the person who does the initial nodule count or lesion
Yeah.
count, you're the person who needs to keep doing
Yes. Yes.
because there's variances on the way people do those. So
Yeah.
though there will never be a way of getting away from having
Yeah.
in-person visits, but
Yeah.
whatever we can do to make it as easy on patients, I think is really kind of where things are starting to change. And I think it's going to be really exciting to see how that continues to change for new
Yeah.
trials that are starting out.
Yeah. Yeah. And that I think is tech innovation in a nutshell. And I will say this, and probably if there's any pharmaceutical companies listening, which hopefully not, they should cover their ears, but the pharmaceutical companies are highly incentivized to keep patients in the trial and they will pay to transport you. Like I had a patient who moved and they were 3 hours from the closest site, and the pharmaceutical company was willing to reimburse all of the travel for that and pay for a hotel so that they did not drop out of the study. And they don't tell everybody that at the beginning because it's not something that they are just going to pay for everyone to drive 4 hours, to be in a study site, especially if there's one closer. But definitely that's something that's an option. And they're trying to do more remote things like blood draws, have a nurse come to the house to do your regular physical exam so that you can limit some of those visits where we're just looking at safety labs, for example, or how you're doing overall. So I think we'll see a lot of innovation in that space. And really it was meant, I think, to increase participation of patients who do not have the means to be able to leave work all the time, or they're so sick they can't travel all the time, and or they live in a rural area and so they'll send somebody to you. And so I'm really hopeful that this will mean something to patients and it'll increase their participation. But it's like you said, there are certain things that have to be done in person with the actual study physician.
Yeah, it feels like everything is being turned on its head right now as far as the way it's always been done is no longer the way that things are continuing to work. And it's actually a really exciting time to see
Yeah.
the engagement of, patient advocacy groups
Yeah.
into this to figure out how we can help the patient population and make
Yeah.
this much more sustainable and for longevity. And, the pharmaceutical companies have a vested interest in that because they need
Yeah.
us to participate. So
Yeah.
making
Well,
that as easy on patients as possible.
it's probably also cheaper for them on some level to do this than to force everyone to come in to see me all the time. But this is the only benefit I think, maybe there's others, but that came out of COVID in medicine is that it became quite clear that there were services that could be offered virtually and could be paired with in-home services and come up with the same level of care. So
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree. And I think, yes, one of the nice things is not having to be in person all the time. I do miss like the in-person stuff, but
yeah,
knowing that we can do it virtually there's something beautiful about that now,
yeah.
for sure. All right, anything else? I mean, those were all the questions I had for you.
No, I think, oh, I do have one last word of wisdom because I tell this to, I think, young faculty members or physicians who are starting out too. And I also tell this to patients, but a lot of people view clinical trials as a last resort. Like, I should only participate in a clinical trial if everything else that is available no longer works for me or never worked for me. And I just really don't think that that's how clinical trials should be positioned. In oncology, they are sometimes positioned like that, but there's also many people who go into studies as their first line, and it's because like I did the bimekizumab studies and the secukinumab studies, and I had patients who had never taken biologics before, and that was their very first time. And I had other patients who had taken everything, and that was like there were no other options, and so that's why they joined. But some of these trials can truly be life-changing opportunities for patients. And if you always wait until you've tried everything else, you might miss out on a really good opportunity. And it's definitely scary and it's not for everybody. But some of my patients love being in trials because they see me for hours every time they come. They get a meal, like people are waiting on them. And it's like they can relax in a bed, get paid, and watch TV. And they always have somebody to call. They're not like going through the phone tree in the office or trying to send a message. Like we're much more responsive because we're worried about the patients in the trials. And sometimes it's hard for them to go back to regular care after that. But it just has come so far. And if we do not have patients who do studies, we will never find these sort of groundbreaking, life-changing therapies. Um, so I just really hope that this helps clear up questions. And you're everyone listening, you're very lucky to have Brinley because I've never met a patient who's as knowledgeable and as strong of an advocate in this disease state. So you're the best resource I've ever met.
Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you so
Like
much. I mean,
truly.
thank you for agreeing to come on and talk about this today. I know, listen, we could talk about like anything HS forever, like weeks on end without sleeping. So maybe one day we'll have to do that. We should have like an HS little retreat with everybody and just talk HS the
Yeah.
whole time. So thank you again so much for joining us today. Thank you for answering the questions. If there are any questions from anybody, please feel free to email me at contact@hsconnect.org, and we will be sure to get an answer for you. And next week, we are doing the importance of participation in clinical trials. So if you haven't signed up for that one yet, go ahead and register, and we will see you then. Thank you again, Dr. Porter. I appreciate
Thank you
it.
so much.
All right,
Bye.
bye.